Good afternoon, and welcome to Graduate Speak Insights on Transforming Education. My name is Joanna Van Hoff, and I'm the Program Director for Education here at Cardus. We are so glad that you could join us for this inaugural webinar in a series of webinars in celebration of Cardus's 25th anniversary year. That's right, we're 25 this year, and we are very excited about that. And we are celebrating in a variety of different ways. And one of them is to bring our work in all of our program areas to you through this series, and this one is the first. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with Cardus Education, I'd like to give you a very brief introduction to who we are. Cardus is a public policy think tank rooted in the Christian social thought tradition. And that means for Cardus Education, two things. One, we believe in the fundamental God-given dignity of all human beings, including children, and in the necessity of an education that forms them according to their unique gifts and abilities, and within communities that honor the cultural and religious values that they have. So we engage in research and policy that allows schools of all kinds to flourish. Second, we believe that humans were made for community, that education is not purely an individual undertaking, and that even when we're talking about the primary unit of the family and education in the home, such as homeschooling, education always has a public or a social impact. It's not just about meeting the needs of each individual, it's also about the reality of living in community, in society, and building a common life together. What better way to demonstrate that than through our work in graduate outcomes? How do graduates fare in different kinds of schools? That's what we're here to talk about today, and I'm thrilled to have three experts with us to unpack these results. We do hope to take questions at the end of this webinar, so please use the Q&A feature that is on the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, and we'll be monitoring those as they come in. Before I introduce our speakers, a little bit about the Cardus Education Survey. The Cardus Education Survey has previously been completed in Canada, in the US, and in Australia. This most recent iteration of the Cardus Education Survey is of US graduates, aged 25 to 39, and the data is taken from a nationally representative sample of graduates across school sectors. It's very high quality data. And Cardus is grateful for the partnership and the funding support of the Center for School Leadership at Baylor University, as well as the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. With us today to unpack this data is Dr. Lynn Swaner. Lynn is President US of Cardus, and in addition to stakeholder development throughout the US, she directs and leads the Cardus Education Survey. As an expert and an author on flourishing in education and education systems, she is perfectly poised to bring deep insight into this project, and we're grateful for her leadership. Dr. Jon Eckert is a professor and Linda and Robert Koppel Endowed Chair of Educational Leadership at Baylor University, where he leads the Baylor Center for School Leadership. He brings decades of personal teaching experience, as well as teacher training to this role, as well as experience gained in the US Department of Education, where he served as a teaching ambassador fellow under both the Bush and Obama administrations. And he is also a Cardus Senior Fellow. And finally, Dr. Albert Cheng is also a Cardus Senior Fellow, as well as an associate professor in the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas, where he directs the Classical Education Research Lab. He serves on the boards of Anthem Classical Academy, as well as the International Journal of Christianity and Education, and is a research affiliate of the Program on Educational Policy and Governance at Harvard University. He's also, I believe, the mastermind behind the data analysis that we will go through today. So welcome again, and I'll turn it over to you, Lynn.
Hey, well, welcome everyone. Thank you, Joanna, for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be together with Albert and Jon sharing on our new data from the Cardus Education Survey. So the title of our webinar, of course, is Graduate Speak: Insights on Transforming Education. But before we can talk about how to transform education, which is obviously a very popular topic that many of us are engaged in conversation around, we need to actually ask whether and how education is transformative. So a little bit of a play on words there to try and actually understand what and how education actually is transformative. So here's some questions we can consider. First of all, what kinds of outcomes would we think of as transformative? And in sort of plainer language, what do we actually care about in education? What are the things that we care about? And that obviously is contested, depending on the type of school, depending on the audience who's considering this. But what do we actually care about in schools? And then how would we know if education actually leads to those outcomes? Where would we look? Who would we ask? And there are many different types of answers to that we could seek. So as Joanna mentioned, our work at Cardus, we do a lot of work around graduate outcomes, and we have one of the largest and most rigorous surveys on these types of outcomes. And Albert will be sharing a little bit about the methodology in a moment, but suffice it to say right now, that is a holistic, robust instrument that looks like all different kinds of outcomes. You can see some of them here on the screen. Joanna also mentioned that we've fielded 4 times in the US, most recently in 2023, 3 times in Canada, with hopefully an additional one happening in 2026. We're beginning planning right now. And we've also fielded once in Australia and are looking to do a second iteration there. So briefly, who are our audiences? Who is interested in this data? And there are essentially 3 main types. The first is policymakers and policy influencers. So those who particularly support school choice legislation in the US find the CES helpful to demonstrate the value of diverse school sectors. Practitioners also, and many of you are probably here on the call as a practitioner, such as school leaders, utilize the CES data to support a lot of their return on investment claims for their schools. So their sector, their parents, their different audiences may say, what difference does sending my child to this type of school make? And so we have had quite a few different schools and practitioners use this data as they're talking with families. And then finally, educational innovators have used the data to do new and exciting things like establishing collaborative networks. We've even had new industry associations founded based on, informed by the data, and also informing special gatherings of thought leaders. So those are just 3 types of audiences that have found the CES data to be helpful. Joanna mentioned, and you can certainly download for free our report. And I'm going to turn it over to Albert now, who will actually unpack our methodology.
Okay, I think I'm set here. Sorry about that. I apologize for that. So what I want to spend a little bit of time going over are the methods that we use to gather our data. And so in case you aren't familiar with the Cardus Education Survey, this is actually we've actually been doing this for over a decade now, almost 15 years. The first one was conducted in the US in 2011. And you can see that we've done it in the US in 2014, 18, and now most recently in 2023. And so we're going to be talking about what we found in this 2023 data collection. In all the reports, what we try to do is to estimate the school sector effect. In other words, what's the effect of going to a particular kind of school? And in each of the surveys, we've always obtained a nationally representative sample of high school graduates, and the ages usually range from about 24 to 39. And so in all the studies, we consider the major school sectors in each country. So here in the United States, the 5 largest sectors are the traditional public schools, Protestant Christian schools, Catholic schools, other non-religious independent schools, and homeschooling. And in each of the reports, we try to understand what the influence of each school sector is on a range of outcomes, including academic outcomes, spiritual, cultural, civic, and relational outcomes. What's new in the 2023 iteration of this is we have a separate chapter that focuses on mental health and well-being, as we know that this has become a major issue in the last 5 years. Okay, and so for the 2023 report, this is data that we've gathered from October 10th through October 22nd, using in partnership with Ipsos Public Affairs. They have what we call the knowledge panel, which is one of the largest online and representative panels here in the United States. And so we asked them to help us sample 2,350 adults, ages 24 to 39. And if you're doing the math, what this means is that the youngest set of respondents in our sample graduated high school in 2017. Which means that all of this data precedes the COVID pandemic. And so if you're wondering if we can speak to the effects of the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, you're going to have to wait for some forthcoming reports that we'll do when we do this again. So again, these are snapshots of adults who finished high school before the COVID pandemic. Okay, and so just to give you a sense of what the sample looks like, as you can see from the table, the vast majority of adults in the United States attended traditional public schools. But you can see also the variety of different kinds of schools that many folks in the general population of the United States have attended. Certainly there's a healthy, robust group of folks that went to Catholic schools, Protestant schools, other independent schools as well. Okay, and so in the set of results that we're going to present, or that Jon is going to talk about, what we're going to focus on in this presentation is the school sector effect. And so the way we try to identify what the impact a school has on graduate outcomes is to control for demographic characteristics like family background, home life, socioeconomic characteristics of the respondents, because those things do also influence graduate outcomes above and beyond the effect that schools have. And so by controlling some of these characteristics away, we hope to isolate what we think is the contribution that a school sector has to graduate outcomes. Jon's going to explain this in a little bit more as he walks you through the figures, but in all the figures, what you're going to see is a baseline set at 0. And what that 0 means is that's set at the average for a particular outcome for a graduate of a public school. And again, what Jon will show you in the figures are separate bars, and the bars are going to show you the difference regarding a particular outcome for adults who graduated in other school sectors. Okay, and so we're going to walk through multiple categories of findings: perceptions of high school, educational attainment and vocational outcomes, civic formation, mental health and well-being, faith formation, and values formation as well. Forgot family formation, of course, is another thing we consider. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jon, who is going to give you a tour of the findings.
All right, Albert, as soon as you stop. Oh, perfect. I think that should work. Here we go. So this is really a snapshot. So I'm going to move you through these pretty quickly with the idea that we want to leave space for Q&A. So if there's something that you're curious about, please feel free to ask. Right now, you should be seeing a giant camera in the screen that should help you know what we're digging into. So we're going to start with this. This super interesting and positive findings here over high school experiences and overall quality. So hopefully these findings will be helpful and fairly self-explanatory, but Albert did a nice job setting up what you were going to see. We're really going to look at these blue bars here primarily because they're the ones that take into account different variables. For example, the educational attainment of the parent, their socioeconomic status, a number of the things that you would expect to benefit a student that may not exist in the public school cohort because each of these, the 3 options you see here, are a choice that a parent has made in the US, which would cost them additional tuition dollars. So the populations are slightly different. And so what we've done to that is try to control for some of those differences. So you'll see the orange bar that is the actual just raw effect. That's just the raw score difference, excuse me. The effect is the blue bar. So that's the more reliable measure, more valid measure of the difference. So we're going to pay attention to both. You'll notice these there'll be asterisks after each one. And so if you see the 3, that means with 99% confidence, we think the difference is not random. If you see 2 dots, that is 0.05, so that's 95% confidence. So that just means that we're more confident that it's not just a random difference in the results. So for example, on this one, how favorably did you feel about the quality of the education at your high school that you received? This is what came back. So Protestant, Catholic, and non-religious private schools all were higher, and significantly higher when you don't consider the school effect. When you add that in, they're still higher. It just dropped a bit for Protestant schools in the difference. So overall, that's positive. And then the other piece I want to point out is, Albert said this as well on this next slide, the 0 line, that's just the average score where the students in public schools responded as graduates. So at 24 to 39 years old, looking back, that's where they were at. So that 0 baseline is there. So this is the difference above or below that line. So how well did your high school prepare you academically for success in post-secondary education or training? Like, pretty important role for schools to play. And you'll see that in all 3 sectors, those were significantly higher rates. So 22, 28, and 33% higher in Protestant, Catholic, and non-religious schools, even when factoring in those outside variables. How well did your high school prepare you for success in a job or career? All right. Also really encouraging here. So 25, 25, and 26%, very remarkably consistent across all 3 sectors. How well did your high school prepare you for strong personal relationships? Whether we're believers or not, this is something that people think makes for a more flourishing life. In fact, that's one of the most important factors, even that secular humanists will agree on is important. And on those measures, Protestant, Catholic, and non-religious private schools performed significantly better, 13%, 16%, and 22% better. How well did your high school prepare you for having a vibrant spiritual life or religious life? Now, obviously, for Catholic schools and Protestant schools, that's going to be an outcome that they care deeply about. And you'll see here 26 and 36% better. And you see the drop off then for non-religious schools in the US. Obviously, a number of our private schools in the US, in their independence, they're independent of the system, but they don't necessarily have a faith-based background. And so in this case, 8% more valued that, but that's not probably what's animating a lot of the work of those schools in the US. Teachers really cared about their students. Again, Protestant, Catholic, non-religious schools performed very well here, 12%, 14%, 25%. Now, I personally, as a Protestant Christian, I look at this and I see, and it's like, oh, well, if we see kids made in the image of God, how would we not communicate this to them? Because this is our calling. This is this rich calling that we have. And so 12% is great. I'm super curious as to why the non-religious schools are at double that. They're 25% higher than the public school, where Protestant and Catholic schools are at 12 and 14%. Those kinds of findings are the ones that intrigue me, because this is not a mixed method study. All we have is the data that say this is what graduates felt. So for whatever reason, this is where they landed. My school was a close-knit community. This is a fascinating one. Again, these are all schools that families, at least, have chosen to send their kids to. And so they may be small schools, they may be larger schools. On average, these are typically smaller than public schools in the US. So this close-knit community, that makes sense. And I think they're meeting their mission here. 26, 29, and 35% more students felt like it was a close-knit community. Now, one of the slides we don't have in here for time is a second question we asked is, how much did you feel like you belonged at your school? And actually, Protestant schools performed at a lower rate than their public school counterparts and feeling this sense of belonging. So again, we've been talking as researchers, trying to hypothesize why that might be. And you could imagine a scenario in which you're in a close-knit community, but if you're not in that close-knit community, you maybe feel like you don't belong. So there's two sides to this coin. Obviously, we want to create communities that are close-knit, but we also want them to be inclusive, where each student, each member of the community feels like he or she belongs. So that's an interesting flip side of this close-knit finding here. So we move on to the next section, which is educational attainment and vocational outcomes. And so again, one of the things that parents are very interested in is what happens to my kid after they leave high school. And so we're asking 24 to 39-year-olds, this is a great group, to find this out. So what's the highest level of school that you completed? And so each of these is a little bit higher than the public school counterpart. 1% higher for Protestant schools, 18%. So the Catholic schools, a lot higher post-secondary participation, and then 7% for non-religious homeschool. Now, the homeschool comes in because this is now just not talking about a school experience. This is talking about what happens afterwards. Albert's going to dig more into our homeschool numbers, but you'll see those drop off a bit in a significant way for homeschoolers, as well as far as how far they proceed in education. This one is the income distribution. Here, the quartiles are broken down by shades of blue. You'll see on the far right there that independent schools, 44%, are in that top quartile for income in independent schools, or you'll see 28, 22, 29, and then 16 for homeschool. And then you can look on the left-hand side to see where they fall in the lower quartile. So you get some sense of where students come economically on this. And so that, again, might not be surprising on independent school sides in the US, because already tuition is being paid for that in the K through 12 system. So these are interesting questions. So if you want to be helpful to others, how important is a job like that for you? In Protestant schools, 6% more important, 8% for Catholic schools, roughly the same for non-religious schools and homeschools, which I think leads nicely into civic behaviors and values, because there is this sense of how much do people in different types of schools want to serve their communities. And this was one of the driving forces behind some of the initial Cardus surveys, to say that all education is public education, and there is a benefit to educating students well for the common good. And so here's one finding on giving to a nonprofit or charity group within the last 12 months. Again, Protestant schools show they're 11% higher on this, which is significant even when controlling for other factors. Non-religious independent schools also 12% higher there. So all four sectors that are not public school sectors are more likely to report that they are more likely to have given to a nonprofit charity group within the last 12 months. Volunteer work, similarly, Protestant schools here significantly higher here. Catholic schools, non-religious schools higher, but not significantly so. And then homeschoolers are more likely to have volunteered as adults. Again, remember, age 24 to 39. So as I refer to them by school sector, remember, we're talking about the adults reflecting on their experience as adults. How favorably or unfavorably do you feel about how the way your school handled issues of national politics? So again, as Albert pointed out, these students would have all graduated, the youngest ones would have graduated in 2017. So you have a 15-year window going back to the early 2000s, and they would be thinking back on that, where you'll see the Protestant, Catholic, and non-religious schools. Hopefully the homeschoolers felt okay about how their parents, the group of family that was maybe supporting them there, handled this. But on this one, they were more favorable, but only in the independent schools were they significantly more favorable. Interacting with a range of people, all right? So again, Protestant schools, Catholic schools, non-religious schools higher, Catholic schools and non-religious schools significantly higher on feeling like that they were well prepared to interact with a wide range of people in society around them. Now, these are the items we added this year, or in 2023, that we are really excited about in this report, because this has been an ongoing concern, especially coming out of COVID. Again, these results are for adults that went through COVID, but they did not go through school during COVID. So depression and anxiety scores, in this one, you want to be lower because you don't want depression and anxiety. So here, being below that public school average, that 0%, that's a good thing. So you'll see Protestant schools, Catholic schools, non-religious schools, and homeschoolers, when you don't factor in the outside factors that might be influencing it, when you just look at the actual raw difference, they're lower. But when you factor in some of the protective factors that maybe socioeconomic status or educational attainment of parents might provide, they bump up above the public school average, and not significantly so, but they are higher there. So that is an interesting finding there. May tie in some to some of the sense of belonging that maybe they had. We were looking at connections between sense of belonging in high school and then mental health outcomes as adults. So we'll dig more into those findings in future reports. So we're just briefly touching on that. Faith formation, again, for our faith-based schools, this next slide that actually has 4 charts in it is going to be particularly important, maybe less important to non-religious schools. But certainly many homeschoolers put a high premium on the faith-based component of education. So you'll see this large slide to the left. Lynn put this together, I think, nicely so you could see the trends. But belief in God or a higher power, significantly higher in Protestant schools. Interesting, Catholic schools drop off. They're about the same as public schools. Non-religious schools a little bit higher, but not significantly so. And then homeschoolers are right there at the Protestant school level for belief in a higher power or God. And then related, you'll see similar patterns here on how often do you pray on the graph on the top right, how often do you read the Bible or a sacred text. Again, similar pattern there. How often, if at all, do you attend religious services other than weddings and funerals? So coming up on Easter right now, that's a good question. We didn't ask if they were Christmas and Easter attenders, but that's what we see there. So again, encouraging news there, I think, especially for Protestant schools and homeschoolers, if that is a value of your group, which I'm assuming most of you have, this would be encouraging data. And then finally, we have personal values here. So how important is self-fulfillment to you personally? All right, so here, interestingly, Protestant schools are lower, Catholic schools a bit above, non-religious schools significantly above, and then homeschoolers are here. So less interested in self-fulfillment, but how much do you care about a job fulfilling your calling? Again, this is higher for Protestant, Catholic, and non-religious schools, and significantly higher. So there's this, which again, I find interesting without the faith-based component, that's significantly higher there, but all 3 of those sectors are above. How important to you personally is tolerance for others? Again, this is an interesting finding. Catholic schools and non-religious schools are above the public school average. Protestant schools and homeschoolers just below, but not significantly below in tolerance. How important to you is community involvement? Again, only the non-religious schools are higher than the public school average here. So Protestant schools and Catholic schools and homeschoolers are all significantly lower when you factor in outside variables. All right. Oh, and as a component of that, I was kind of thinking of family formation as part of this, but family formation, another interesting finding on marriage. So the percentage of people never married. So again, nothing positive or negative here, but the Protestant average is lower in having never been married. So that means that they are more likely to have been married. So it's a little bit when you get these negative terms at the top. So Albert can correct me if I'm wrong in a minute when he jumps on, but this means that Protestants are more likely to have been married. Non-religious independent schools are less likely to have been married. And then homeschoolers are similar to Protestant schools there. So they're more likely to be married when you consider the outside variables. It's not significantly different. So that was a lot of data. I am going to turn it over to Albert so that he can dig in a little bit on those homeschool findings. But hopefully we have some time to dig in on those on Q&A. So Albert, it's all yours.
Thanks, John, for that. And so with the rest of the presentation of results, we want to talk a little bit about a second report that we released using the Cardus 2023 iteration of the Cardus Education Survey. And this is a report that was released this past February. You can find it on the Cardus website that focuses primarily on homeschoolers. And so as the title suggests, diverse outcomes for a diverse population. One of the things in the report that we wanted to do was to underscore the diversity within the homeschooling sector, which typically up until now has really been overlooked. And in particular in this report, we want to focus on this fact that adults who have ever been homeschooled during their primary and secondary education did so for varying amounts of time. And I know there's probably a conventional wisdom out there that thinks that says adults who are, children who are homeschooled are probably likely homeschooled for most of their kindergarten through 12th grade education. And what we've done in using the data we've collected is to test that. And we found that's actually not true. And so what you actually have in front of you on your screen here is a bar graph showing the percentage of adults who, by the number of years they were homeschooled, assuming that they spent any time in that sector. And so what I want you to notice in this is that we do have on the very right-hand side of the graph a large proportion of ever homeschooled adults spending all of their primary and secondary education in that sector. That's about 15% of all homeschooled adults. But actually on the flip side, it's also worth mentioning that 20% of ever homeschooled adults and 15% of ever homeschooled adults spent only 1 to 2 years in that sector respectively. And so what this really underscores is a diversity in the duration in which children who are homeschooled actually spent, there's diversity in the amount of time that such children spend in that sector. And so what we wanted to do in this report was to examine outcomes by type of homeschooler or to consider whether outcomes of homeschoolers differed based on how long they spent in that sector. And so what we did in this report was we broke up the sample of adults who had spent time in the homeschooling sector into 3 equal groups, which we're going to call short-term, medium-term, and long-term homeschoolers. Short-term homeschoolers only spent 1 to 2 years in that sector. Medium-term homeschoolers only spent 3 to 7 years, while long-term homeschoolers spent 8 to 13 years in that sector. And so before I jump to the results, I want to first underscore this. Something I think that's worth mentioning is how much time do homeschoolers spend in other school sectors? And so what this chart here breaks down the number of years on average that short, medium, and long-term homeschoolers spend in not just in the homeschooling sector, but in independent schools and in traditional public schools. And one thing to note, I'll just highlight one result here. If you look at short-term homeschoolers, again, they only spent 1 to 2 years in the homeschooling sector. They spent over 8 years attending traditional public schools. And so contrary to maybe the conventional wisdom, at least certainly here in the United States, we have a significant proportion of people who have been homeschooled, but also at the same time have spent quite a bit of time enrolled in their local public school. And so let's get to the results. How do homeschoolers differ based on the amount of time they were homeschooled? And I want to just characterize the results before we display them. So out of the 3 groups of homeschoolers, and perhaps this is not surprising, short-term homeschoolers look most like adults who never spent any time in that sector. And then on the flip side, long-term homeschoolers typically look mostly like medium-term homeschoolers. Now, it's important to also say that this pattern is not always consistent across the results. sometimes a particular level of an outcome didn't always increase as the amount of time spent in that sector increased. And so I'll point to some of those exceptions. But let's jump into some of the specific results. Here's one on educational attainment. So just to focus on the dark blue bars there, those depict the proportion of non-homeschoolers, short-term, medium-term, and long-term homeschoolers that have at most a high school diploma. And as you can see there, 27% of non-homeschoolers never moved beyond high school. That's compared to 36% of short-term homeschoolers, so pretty close percentages. On the other hand, medium and long-term homeschoolers, 47 and 41% of them respectively only had a high school diploma. And if you take a look at the lighter blue bars at the top, you can see that conversely, rates of attaining at least a bachelor's degree or even a graduate degree are similar across those two respective groups. This in some ways translates into differences in employment. Again, focusing on the darkest blue, which depicts the percent of adults who are employed full-time. You can see that full-time employment rates are highest among non-homeschoolers. Although here, long-term homeschoolers and short-term homeschoolers aren't that far behind the adults who've never been homeschooled. It's actually medium-term homeschoolers that have the lowest full-time employment rates. Just to consider some other outcomes, we consider a range of civic outcomes as Jon discussed. But here for the homeschool report, or at least in this presentation, we'll focus on the outcome of volunteering. And so here we see is that volunteering is, at least the likelihood of doing that is highest among long-term homeschoolers. Considering other outcomes like religious engagement, here's an example where we see the level of an outcome increasing along with the amount of time spent homeschooling. And so long-term homeschoolers and medium-term homeschoolers are most religiously engaged, i.e. they pray most often among other adults, are more likely, are more often engage or read sacred texts, and attend religious services regularly compared to non-homeschoolers and short-term homeschoolers. Okay, and finally, just to look at marriage, this graph presented it in the opposite way without the double negatives that Jon was walking through, and Jon did explain that correctly here. So here, we avoided the double negatives, but just currently married. So marriage rates, here we see long-term homeschoolers being quite exceptional relative to the rest of the population. 63% of them are currently married, compared to only 40% of adults who have never been homeschooled. And so there are many other results with that report, but for now I want to turn it back over to Lynn, who's going to offer some overarching commentary over all of this data.
Great. Thank you so much, Albert, and thank you, Jon, for sharing these results. I want to mention, before I sort of put a bit of a bow on this and then we open it up for Q&A, that we have 2 more reports that are coming out this year. So stay tuned, one hopefully towards the end of the summer and then one a little bit later in the fall. The first will be on gratitude and service across all of the sectors in the data. And then the second will be on stability of faith and values among particularly the Protestant school and homeschooling sector, because as was alluded to, we've been collecting this data for almost 15 years, and we've seen just this incredible stability in higher outcomes for those schools that had that explicit purpose. So we hope to get those reports out. You'll see those if you haven't signed up on our newsletter. Make sure that you do that so that we can alert you when those come out. And as I just wrap up, if you haven't sent your questions over, please go ahead and do that. Joanna is collecting and curating those, and she'll be on in a minute to help to facilitate that with us. So we started out this presentation by saying before we want to transform education, we need to ask how education is transformative. So we need to ask about outcomes. What do we care about? And then where would we look? Who would we ask if we could find out what those outcomes are? And obviously through the CES, we ask graduates themselves. So here's a quick summary. And again, thank you to Albert for focusing in on homeschooling, but just to sort of tie a bow on it, here's some summaries of the independent school outcomes. And this is across all the different types of independent schools. In general, independent school graduates report higher positive overall experiences, and they rate their overall education quality higher. They demonstrate greater degree attainment and vocational outcomes compared to public school counterparts. They also exhibit higher rates of civic engagement and volunteerism. And for those schools with an explicit religious purpose, higher levels of faith formation and values. And again, importantly, those differences persist even after we control for graduate background characteristics, which is very important. So things like family income and religiosity. So I want to share this quote from a book called No One Way to School, Pluralism and American Public Education, written by Dr. Ashley Berner, who's at Johns Hopkins, and she's also a Cardus Senior Fellow. And she talks about the importance of educational pluralism as a way to actually further democracy and to meet diverse needs within a society. So I'll read this quote. As to the definition. Educational pluralism means, quote, changing the structure of public education so that state governments fund and hold accountable a wide variety of schools, including religious ones, but do not necessarily operate them. Such educational pluralism provides a better way to train an increasingly diverse generation of young people in habits of academic excellence, moral clarity, and democratic citizenship. Educational pluralism offers a different way of doing public education by accommodating both individual belief and the common good. And it suggests a way out of the winner-takes-all mentality that characterizes so many educational debates today. So we started with the question of how do we transform education? And the data from the CES suggests that actually educational pluralism is a way to do that instead of a one-size-fits-all model. A lot of times when we talk about transforming educational systems, we're talking about rethinking structures to better serve the needs of all students, so making education more equitable, more innovative, more responsive to the needs of society today. And again, our data suggests that educational pluralism is a strategy for transforming education, and it does encourage innovation through diverse schooling options. One of the things we'll be looking to do in the future CES iteration, when we do this in about another 2 years, is to try and take into consideration the wide variety of innovative educational methods and structures that have come into play. So if you think about hybrid schools, we think about online schools, we think about different pedagogical formats like classical schools. So how do we actually account for that? We're working on that right now because the more diverse our system is, the stronger it bolsters these outcomes that lead to this sort of meeting of diverse needs in society. And again, educational pluralism challenges the one-size-fits-all model by embracing different ways of schooling to meet student needs. And it can make systems more just and equitable because families are empowered to make decisions. Communities can shape education that reflects their values and meets their unique needs. So I'll turn that over with that to Joanna to facilitate our Q&A time.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you for sharing these results. And I'd like to maybe just dive into some of the questions that are coming in. If you have more questions, certainly feel free to enter them into the Q&A. Question that I'd like to maybe start off with is regarding school culture. So you kind of alluded to some connections perhaps that we can make between school culture and the outcomes that we're seeing. We know that school culture is something that is really critical and crucial to higher academic and social outcomes. So I'm wondering if you can speak to what are some takeaways that you would say on the importance of school culture, and what factors specifically would you say in the data might kind of connect to that? I'm opening the floor to sort of any one of you, I suppose, whoever wants to jump in first.
I think
We
it's a
are-
race to see who gets to who can find our unmute button first. John, go ahead.
always defer to Lynn, President of Cardus US. So Lynn, take it away, and then I'll add in if there's anything I think that would be useful, but go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is obviously, culture is key. A lot of the definitions of culture are helpful. Some are not as helpful. But I think the most important thing that I've seen as I've visited schools is the concept of a thick culture. So in fact, if there's a thick culture, it's cohesive. Everything is aligned. I think if you're a school leader, that's something that's really important to you, that your mission, your vision, your values align with everyday practice. And we see in the data that actually when schools make an effort, when they pay attention to something, we see changes. So for example, for those who are familiar with the Protestant Christian school world, back in 2011, when the first CES data came out, it showed that actually Protestant Christian school graduates were lagging behind their public school counterparts on a number of academic outcomes and educational attainment. And that has been reversed now. So graduates are actually at the same level. We'd like to go higher, of course. But I share that because I think that's a really good example of how schools have shaped their cultures in such a way. If you're familiar with those schools, we've done other studies. Jon and I have co-authored on innovative missions and models in Christian education. And you'll see schools that are saying that actually it's really important for us to integrate faith and academics. And so they're able to innovate and to do that through a whole range of cultural interventions. So it's not just simply we added more courses. It's actually, well, how are we refocusing our entire curriculum and our program? And so I think it's good news when you think about holistic outcomes, but also how do you think about holistic interventions at the cultural level? So I hope that answers the question. I think we should be thinking about alignment. I think we should be thinking about creating that thick culture where everything interlocks and interplays together.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if either of you wanted to add anything there, Jon, or we can.
I'll go to the next question. We'll add something.
Sure. Sure. I think it actually kind of this maybe connects. The next question is one on related to mental health outcomes. So we saw some of those lower mental health outcomes for maybe non-religious students. And so Tom is asking whether it's possible from this data to make a correlation between some of the mental health outcomes and perhaps some of the better religious outcomes that we might see in the Protestant and homeschooling communities. Did they also have better mental health outcomes, and might those things be correlated?
Albert did all the crunching there and is probably the best suited to answer that question. I will say one thing that we've found that I think is interesting is, you speaking, this bridges Lynn's comment about culture, the outcomes that are stronger in the Protestant and Catholic schools that you would expect to be stronger on the volunteerism, some of that kind of faith being a component, that does seem to be translating into adults. So that's encouraging. So I'll let Albert speak to the technical piece of it. And I'll just add one quick thing on the belonging piece. We're doing a paper just looking at belonging, not even looking at school sector, but how much does that sense of belonging at school impact those mental health outcomes, regardless of sector? And it's significant. It is a significant correlation between whether they feel like they belonged at their school and whether they feel a high level of life satisfaction, mental health outcomes, and educational attainment. Interestingly, it doesn't seem to have affected civic engagement, which is interesting. But those three, just that one item on belonging seems to have a significant effect on long-term where it is. But that kind of makes sense. Like if you don't feel like you belong in high school, you don't feel like you belong there, that's not always going to get better. It does for some, but it doesn't for everyone, and there seems to be a correlation there. But Albert can probably speak in more detail about that.
Yeah, I guess I hope I don't sound like I'm punting in some sense. I mean, as we really want to stick with what the data show, and so to kind of peek under the hood to go another level, it's tough for us to conclusively say anything about what is the specific cause behind some of the outcomes that we've observed. And so it's true. Well, first of all, I think we should point out that it was mostly only homeschoolers, if anybody, that showed more positive mental health indicators. I mean, if you refer to the full report, there are other questions that we asked, things like, do you agree with this statement? I feel helpless dealing with life's problems. Or we assessed respondents' sense of gratitude, or feeling a sense of purpose in life. And on balance, there wasn't that much difference. There weren't that many differences across the sectors, with the exception of homeschoolers. And so I think that raises some questions of why that's the case. Now, I think, some of the specific content that different sectors cover, it probably contributes to that, but it's tough for us to ascertain that based on the data we have. But I think those are reasonable hypotheses. I think it'd be a great idea if we, in hindsight, or next time, administered, some kind of measurement on how people think about suffering or hope, to speak into that a little bit more.
That's great. That's helpful. And I think this might be a question that you have been asked before, but how does, if at all, school size factor into these results or these data? Can education leaders take any takeaway in terms of, like, if I have a school size that's really large, for example, might school belonging kind of be reduced? People feel like they're sort of just a number in the crowd, or vice versa. Any insight on that in the data?
Yeah, I'll weigh in first, and if the others have anything to add. Yeah, so we didn't measure school size. So again, I think this is just one of these examples where we could generate data to give us a general sense of what the patterns are. I mean, it just takes another level of granularity in the data to then dig into the specific mechanisms. But that being said, there is plenty of research out there linking school size to sense of belonging. And so you couple that with, I think, what's also an empirical fact. A lot of private schools tend to be smaller than lots of public schools as well. And so that partially, potentially explains some of the differences in outcomes. And so, yeah, I think that school size is definitely an asset for that. And I would, at the same time, though, push and say that, school size is not a guarantee as well, right? So I think there's some level of intentionality on the part of the school community to make sure they're welcoming and people feel belong. This, Jon explained, you could be a close-knit community, but if you're that one student that is on the outside within that close-knit community, it feels even worse.
Right, and they did a lot of work. Gates Foundation started off funding small schools as an initiative to improve academic outcomes, and they couldn't find that actually having a great deal of effect. And it may have been some of the implementation and some of that. There's a lot of factors that go into it. But yeah, to Albert's point, we didn't measure that. It'd be hard, I think, for a 35-year-old to think back and say, I think my school was this size. I mean, so you would have questions unless you could go back and find the name of the school at the time the student was there, which is not a level that we got to. And so that we can't really say much definitively there. I think what Albert said is correct. Most of the time our private schools are smaller. Typically private schools have these types of cultures that may or may not be impacting some of the things that are there, but that's not data we can actually answer. We can't do much with that to get to answers from those data. Right.
Yes, thank you. We have, I think, time for one final question. And so Robert's asking, when you look at significant positive outcomes, are you able to determine specific causes, teacher qualities, school culture, cohort effect, religious commitment, etc.? Maybe this is sort of also getting at, like, if there was one key takeaway that you would say, like, do this in terms of transforming education, what might it be?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that, you know, our methodology in this research might be a little different to what people are familiar with. So we're not able to really gauge causality for specific things, but it's a little bit stronger than some sort of basic correlational research, because we are doing some of this matching of background characteristics. So we're somewhere in between actually gauging, yes, this caused something, or hey, there seems to be a connection here. We're not really sure what's going on. So we're sort of in this I guess a happy medium, and so that's a place that we feel comfortable drawing some conclusions. I think the biggest piece for me as I look at the data is that when students spend a significant amount of time in a sector, in a school that has an explicit purpose, it's clear on its vision, it's clear on its mission, that you actually see in the data outcomes that, generally speaking, correlate with that. And that may seem pretty obvious. I guess that's like a duh kind of thing. But I think it's really important, and I think it should give educators in all sectors a lot of hope, which is that as they sort of lean into what it is that they say that they're doing, as they look to do it with fidelity, as they look to do it with excellence, as they're willing to innovate in line with what they're purporting to do or what they seek to do, that actually schools do make a difference. There's a lot of research out there. There's questions. I mean, there's policymakers who ask the question, do schools actually even make a difference? Is education transformative? And the answer that we see in the data is yes. And it requires intentionality. It requires really thinking these things through. And I think, importantly, different types of schools contribute to boosts in different types of outcomes. And that's a good thing, because our society is diverse, our society is pluralistic, and I always say this to families and to parents and even to just friends. There is no one way to school that's going to fit every child every year of their life. And so it's important that we have the flourishing of all children in mind. And we don't have time to talk about this today, but certainly the flourishing of educators, that educators are able to be in schools where they can thrive as well. And that's not in the data. This is me opining a bit, but certainly there's tons of other research out there that suggests that. So I think it's a hopeful message. I think it encourages us to continue to lean into the best that we do and to make sure at a structural level and a society level that we encourage and enable all schools, all students, and all families and communities to flourish.
I think that's a really great place to end this webinar. Thank you once again to each of you for your contributions, not only today, but throughout unpacking this data and writing and researching about it. I know we are grateful here at Cardus for your expertise and your contributions. And as Lynn said, keep an eye out for future publications and for future research. We do hope to also be able to do the Cardus Education Survey in Canada and as well in the near future. And in terms of these webinar series, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of 6 webinars for celebrating Cardus's 25th anniversary. The next one, if you are interested, is in our family program, and it will be on the topic of defining the birth dearth. So looking at sort of demographic data, digging into reasons for it, and it will be on May 15th. So keep an eye out also in your inboxes from Cardus for that. With that, thank you all for your attendance. Have a great rest of your afternoon and take care.